Imagine yourself sat aboard this US Airways Airbus A320. You've just heard the engine spool up and you can feel the aircraft pulling itself down the runway, about to take off. As you feel the aircraft lift off from the runway, the nose violently hits the ground and the aircraft comes to a stop to the left-hand side of the runway. Still in a bit of shock and disbelief of what just happened, you're then told you need to emergency evacuate, and then you jump down a slide onto the runway and see the aircraft there with its landing gear destroyed. This is what happened on US Airways Flight 1702, and this will explain how and why this happened. Stay tuned. This is the story of US Airways Flight 1702, an Airbus A320 that was flying from Philadelphia International Airport in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, on the 13th of March 2014. On board the aircraft, there were 2 pilots, 3 flight attendants, and 149 passengers on board. They had a very experienced flight crew on this aircraft at the time. The captain was a 61-year-old male with 23,830 hours of total flying experience, with 4,457 on type on the Airbus A320. And the co-pilot was a 62-year-old female, and she had 6,713 hours of total flying experience, with 4,784 hours on the Airbus A320. For this flight, the captain was going to be the pilot flying, and the co-pilot was going to be the pilot monitoring. So when the flight crew arrived at the aircraft, the first officer, who was the co-pilot, prepared the cockpit whilst the captain spoke with the dispatcher. So the first officer initiated the flight management computer, and with the air traffic control provided flight plan, she entered this and manually entered the departure runway into the flight management computer. When the captain then entered the cockpit, they both checked through and verified the routing that was loaded into the flight management computer, and then continued with the pre-flight checks. At about 17:52 Eastern Standard Time, Flight 1702 was pushed back from gate Bravo 8 at Philadelphia International Airport. At 17:54, they received their final weight and balance information for the flight via the aircraft communication addressing and reporting system. And the first officer then loaded the weight and balance information into the flight management computer, and then she either uplinked or manually entered the V speeds and the flex temperature on the control panel display they had. The flex temperature becomes very important in this particular incident. So just for information, flex and flex temperature is a technique to reduce the amount of thrust used for takeoff. This is beneficial to airliners as the lower thrust settings increase the engine life and reduce maintenance costs and fuel costs of the aircraft. So the flex temperature will be entered into the flight management computer, and this will work out along with the runway length that's been programmed, the aircraft weight, flap setting, and environmental conditions will work out how much thrust it can use to achieve a safe takeoff within the takeoff distance available. So in this incident with US Airways Flight 1702, the first officer inputted the flex temperature and inputted the takeoff runway of 27 right. And at Philadelphia International, they have a parallel runway system, 27 right and 27 left. And this becomes important very soon. So at 18:08, Flight 1702 contacted ground control for taxi instructions, and the air traffic control ground controller advised them that the departure runway was 27 left and provided in taxi instructions to runway 27 left. They then began to taxi, and the first officer then started to carry out the taxi checklist. During the checklist, they got a call from the flight attendant advising that a passenger was in the bathroom. They were then quickly informed that the passenger was returning to their seat, and then the first officer then continued with the checklist as the captain was taxiing towards runway 27 left. At 18:22, as they were arriving to their taxi holding point for runway 27 left, they were cleared to line up and wait on the runway. The first officer then accomplished the remainder of the taxi checklist, and as the captain taxied onto runway 27 left, he noticed that the runway 27 right had been inserted into the flight management computer instead of runway 27 left, and he requested that the first officer change the runway in the flight management computer. This was completed at 18:23. Just 10 seconds later, they were given a heading of 230 degrees on departure and cleared for takeoff. The captain then advanced the thrust levers to the flex detent, and the aircraft started to roll down the runway. When the thrust levers were moved into the flex detent, the crew received an electronic centralized aircraft monitoring message, an ECAM message, indicating that the thrust was not set. The first officer read out this ECAM message: engine thrust levers not set. The captain then briefly moved the thrust levers into the climb detent and then returned back to the flex detent after about 1 second. The captain then responded by saying, "They're set." The aircraft then accelerated past 80 knots, and it was standard operating procedure for the first officer to call out 80 knots and the captain to respond, "Check." The flight crew then noticed that there were no V speeds indicating on their primary flight displays. This meant that there wasn't any speeds indicating at what point that they could reject their takeoff and at what point to rotate the aircraft. As they accelerated through 86 knots, an aural alert sounded in the cockpit. At this point, the captain then asked the first officer, "What did you do? You didn't load. We lost everything." The aircraft continued to accelerate through 143 knots, and then the captain stated, "We'll get that straight when we get airborne," and continued the takeoff roll. The aircraft continued to accelerate over the next several seconds, reaching 152 knots. At this point, the first officer stated, "What? I'm sorry." At this point, the captain then brought the nose pitch up, and the aircraft began to take off, with the nose wheel coming off the ground. This continued for about 4 seconds, and then the captain then pitched nose down to bring the aircraft down. Then also reduced the thrust, but at this point, the nose wheel struck the ground, and then the aircraft bounced back up. The tail of the aircraft then struck the surface of the ground, and the aircraft climbed to about 15 feet above ground level, before then striking the ground with the nose wheel collapsing and the aircraft sliding along the runway, coming to a stop to the left-hand side. During this incident, the airplane nose gear collapsed, resulting in fuselage and engine cowling damage. The rear of the aircraft was also damaged to the fuselage with the tail strike, and there was damage to the left engine, which occurred when the nose gear collapsed, and the ingestion of debris that was caused after that incident. After the aircraft had come to a stop, the flight crew then advised the tower that they aborted the takeoff and that they were going to carry out an emergency evacuation on the runway. The flight attendants then deployed all of the slides normally, and all the passengers disembarked with no injuries. So, how did this happen? As we discussed earlier, the flex temperature in the aircraft was inputted, but the wrong runway was inputted into the flight data computer. So when the first officer changed the runway from 27 right to 27 left, the other data that was based on 27 right was then removed from the flight data computer. This meant that the V speeds and the flex temperature were not inputted into the aircraft. So as the captain moved the thrust levers to the flex detent, the aircraft didn't have the flex temperature to set the appropriate thrust, and therefore gave them the ECAM message which told them that the thrust was not set. During the subsequent interviews after the incident, the first officer reported that there were no V speeds depicted on the primary flight displays, and that is why she did not call V1 or V-rotate during the takeoff. She further stated that she assumed the captain wouldn't continue the takeoff if he did not know the V speeds. The captain then stated that he had recalled the V speeds as they were briefed from the taxi checklist for the other runway, 27 right, which happened to be the same speeds as 27 left. So the captain continued the takeoff roll despite the lack of display V speeds, as he used the ones that were previously briefed. So with that in mind, why did the captain reject the takeoff after rotation? So the captain stated that he had the perception the aircraft was unsafe to fly, and he decided that it was the safest option not to continue, and that's why he commenced the rejected takeoff. The aircraft was flying at 167 knots when the captain reduced the thrust levers to idle and pitched the nose down, which was well above the V1 speed of 157 knots. One other point to note is with the thrust not set ECAM message that was happening, this continued throughout the takeoff and was very unusual to the captain, as he only knew it's happening on landing. However, in this situation, if the captain was to increase the thrust levers to the takeoff go-around detent, it would have negated the thrust not set ECAM message, and the aircraft would have continued as normal without any warnings. It is very unusual for a pilot to reject a takeoff after V1 and V-rotate, as these speeds usually depict that there isn't enough runway to stop the aircraft after it's reached these speeds. However, the captain believed that the aircraft was unsafe to fly and made a decision that he thought would save everyone's lives. Ultimately, in this situation, everybody came away without any injuries, but the aircraft was written off. But I'd love to hear what you guys think. Do you think the captain made the right decision? Obviously, we don't know, we weren't there, and it's only speculation at this point. But I would love to hear what you guys think. I've heard of previous incidents in the past where captains have rejected a takeoff after the V-speeds, and it was the right decision to make, even though it was against their standard operating procedures. But for this one, I'm not too sure, but I wasn't there, so I can't say. So I'd love to hear what you guys think. Please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.